Richard Whitmore paused at the corner cafe, the one he passed nearly every evening on his way home from the office. The air smelled faintly of roasted beans and rain-soaked pavement, and he stepped inside less out of habit than from a vague reluctance to return to the silence of his house. The place buzzed with students bent over laptops, couples whispering, and the occasional tired professional unwinding after a long day. Behind the counter, Ethan Miller moved quickly between orders, balancing cups with the dexterity of someone who had grown used to doing three things at once. Richard's gaze lingered a moment too long. There was a vitality in the young man's presence, something unpolished yet magnetic. Richard noticed the warmth in Ethan's smile as he handed a drink to a customer, the way he brushed his hair from his forehead with a quick, unconscious gesture. When it was Richard's turn to order, Ethan greeted him with polite cheer. "Good evening, sir. What can I get for you?" Richard requested his usual black coffee, his voice quieter than he intended. Their exchange was brief, yet something in the simplicity of Ethan's manner stayed with him. Richard carried his drink to a corner table, pretending to check emails while his eyes flicked toward the counter. Ethan laughed lightly with another customer, a laugh that stirred a restless echo inside Richard. Richard's life, at 50, felt defined by structure. Meetings, deadlines, social obligations. Then the long drive back to a suburban home where the lights were often dim and the air heavy with unspoken words. His wife, Helen, once the center of his universe, now seemed more like a cohabitant than a partner. Conversations were limited to schedules, bills, and their grown children's updates. Affection had long ago slipped into memory, leaving Richard with an ache he carried in silence. Watching Ethan, he became aware of that ache more sharply. He was not naive. He knew the risks of noticing someone so much younger. Yet, the attraction wasn't merely physical. It was the energy, the sense of possibility, the reminder of what it felt like to be alive without restraint. Richard's chest tightened as he sipped his coffee, telling himself it was harmless curiosity. Ethan, meanwhile, caught Richard's glances in the periphery. At first, he dismissed them as the harmless attention of a middle-aged customer. But there was something steady, thoughtful in Richard's expression that unsettled him in a curious way. Ethan was used to attention, mostly clumsy or fleeting, but this was different. This felt measured, intentional. As the evening slowed and the cafe emptied, Ethan found Richard still seated in his corner, coffee long gone cold, staring into the glow of his phone without focus. Something about that solitary figure tugged at him. Perhaps it was the weariness etched in Richard's features, or perhaps it was the quiet dignity with which he carried it. Closing time approached. Ethan wiped down tables, his mind circling around the strange connection he couldn't quite name. Richard rose, slipping on his coat. As he passed the counter, he hesitated. His words came with effort, as though pushing against years of restraint. "You must be exhausted at this hour. When do you usually get a chance to eat?" Ethan blinked, surprised by the personal question. "Honestly, after shifts, I just grab something quick. Nothing proper most nights." Richard hesitated again, then offered a faint, almost nervous smile. "If you'd like, I know a quiet place nearby. Nothing fancy, but the food's good. My treat." The invitation hung in the air, weighted with more than casual politeness. Ethan searched Richard's face for insincerity, but found none. The man's tone was steady, his eyes earnest, as though he were asking not just for company, but for permission to step outside the confines of his own loneliness. A beat of silence passed before Ethan nodded. "Sure. Why not?" The answer startled him, though it felt strangely inevitable. He finished his cleaning quickly, his movements brisk, while Richard waited near the door with a composure that barely masked his anticipation. Outside, the night had settled into a hush, street lamps casting amber pools of light onto slick pavement. Ethan pulled his jacket tighter, a shiver running through him that wasn't from the chill alone. A black sedan eased to the curb, headlights dimmed. Richard opened the passenger door from within, his face illuminated briefly by the dashboard glow. Ethan paused on the sidewalk, heart quickening. The decision had been made, but the uncertainty of what lay beyond it pressed against his chest. He inhaled, steadying himself, then stepped forward, closing the door softly behind him. The engine hummed as they pulled away, neither speaking at first, both caught in the delicate awareness that something had shifted. What began as a simple invitation now carried the weight of unspoken possibilities, and as the cafe lights disappeared in the rearview mirror, Ethan realized he had crossed an invisible threshold. The car moved steadily through quiet streets, the rhythm of the windshield wipers the only sound between them. Richard gripped the wheel with controlled calm, though his thoughts moved in restless circles. He had not planned this. Yet now that Ethan sat beside him, the night felt charged, like a held breath waiting to be released. Ethan glanced at Richard's profile, noting the way the older man's jaw tightened when he concentrated, the faint silver at his temples catching the dashboard light. There was a gravity about Richard, a weight that came not from age but from experience. Ethan found it unexpectedly reassuring. They arrived at a discreet restaurant tucked into a side street, the kind of place where conversations could remain private. Inside, the lighting was low, the murmur of other diners soft and indistinct. A waiter led them to a corner booth, and once seated, Richard exhaled slowly, as if settling into unfamiliar territory. For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only when Richard folded his hands on the table. "I hope this isn't too strange," he said carefully. "I just thought you might deserve more than leftover takeout at midnight." Ethan smiled faintly, the tension in his shoulders easing. "Honestly, it's nicer than anything I've had all week. So, thank you." Their meals arrived quickly, though the food was secondary to the conversation that unfolded. Richard spoke of his work, not in boastful detail, but in the subdued tone of someone weary of corporate life. He described the endless meetings, the polite facades, the feeling that each year blurred into the next. Ethan listened, intrigued, sensing that beneath Richard's polished surface was a man suffocating in routine. Ethan, in turn, shared pieces of his own story. He talked about university courses that felt overwhelming, about working late shifts to cover rent, about the uncertainty that clung to every decision. His honesty surprised even himself. He was not accustomed to speaking so openly with strangers. Yet Richard's attentive gaze made him feel safe, as though his words mattered in a way they rarely did. As the evening deepened, their talk grew more personal. Richard admitted, almost reluctantly, that his marriage had become little more than an arrangement. "Helen and we've been together a long time," he said, fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "But somewhere along the way, the closeness disappeared. We share a house, not a life." Ethan's expression softened. He sensed the weight in Richard's words, the quiet ache of a man bound by duty yet starved of affection. Something in him responded to that vulnerability, though it unsettled him too. He had never imagined being drawn into the hidden fractures of another man's marriage. Richard caught the flicker of hesitation in Ethan's eyes and quickly shifted the subject. Yet the unspoken truth hung between them. This dinner was not simply about food. It was about connection, about filling voids neither had acknowledged until now. When the plates were cleared and the check discreetly paid, Richard offered Ethan a ride home. Outside, the night air was cool, the pavement glistening from a recent drizzle. They walked to the car in silence, each lost in thought. Inside the vehicle, the atmosphere was different than before. The earlier formality had dissolved, leaving behind a quiet intimacy. Their conversation tapered into pauses that felt heavy with meaning. At a stoplight, Richard's hand rested briefly on the console, close enough that Ethan's knuckles brushed against his. The contact was accidental, yet neither of them pulled away. The faint spark of it lingered, undeniable. Richard cleared his throat, eyes fixed on the road. "I shouldn't be keeping you out this late." Ethan shook his head. "It's fine. I don't mind." The drive ended too quickly. When they reached Ethan's apartment building, Richard parked but didn't immediately switch off the engine. They sat in the quiet hum of the car, the tension between them rising like a tide. Ethan unbuckled his seatbelt slowly, unsure if he wanted to end the night. "Thank you," he said at last, his voice low. "For dinner. And for listening." Richard turned to him, his expression unreadable, his eyes carrying both restraint and longing. "You don't have to thank me. I should be thanking you." For a long moment, neither moved. Then Ethan opened the door, the cool night air rushing in. He stepped out, but lingered beside the car, leaning down to meet Richard's gaze once more. Their eyes held, a silent acknowledgement of something beginning, something they both understood but dared not name. Richard forced himself to put the car in gear. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night," Ethan replied, though his tone carried a weight that suggested the night was far from over. As the sedan pulled away, Ethan stood on the sidewalk, watching the taillights disappear into the distance. He felt both exhilarated and uneasy, as though he had taken the first step onto unfamiliar ground. Up the street, Richard gripped the wheel, his pulse quickened. He told himself it was only dinner, only conversation. But deep down, he knew they had crossed an invisible line. The night ended without touch, yet the absence of it was louder than words. The days that followed their dinner carried a strange heaviness for Richard. He returned to his office, to boardrooms and contracts, yet his thoughts drifted again and again to Ethan's face, the quiet intensity in his eyes when he had said thank you. The memory unsettled him, not because of guilt alone, but because it awakened a longing he could no longer deny. Ethan, too, felt the shift. In lectures, he struggled to concentrate, his notebook filling with absent sketches instead of notes. He replayed the evening in fragments. The warmth of Richard's voice, the brush of their hands, the sense of being seen without judgment. The thought both thrilled and frightened him. A week later, Richard's phone buzzed with a short message, "Are you free tonight?" His breath caught. It was Ethan. The words were simple, but the implication was not. Richard hesitated, staring at the screen, then typed back, "Dinner again?" When Ethan replied with a smiling emoji and the name of a quiet hotel restaurant, Richard knew the boundary they had been circling was about to vanish. That evening, Richard arrived to find Ethan already waiting. The younger man's nerves were visible in the way he tapped the table with his fingertips, yet his smile, when Richard entered, carried unmistakable anticipation. Dinner passed quickly, almost rushed, as though both knew the food was only a prelude. Conversation skimmed over safe topics, but beneath each word lay an undercurrent neither could ignore. When the check was paid, Richard suggested a walk, but Ethan shook his head, eyes steady. "We don't have to pretend." The bluntness startled Richard, yet it released something in him. Minutes later, they were in a discreet hotel room, the door closing softly behind them. For a heartbeat, they simply stood there, as though absorbing the enormity of the step they had taken. Richard reached out first, his hand brushing Ethan's cheek, tentative but tender. Ethan leaned into the touch, and in that moment restraint dissolved. The night unfolded slowly, almost reverently. Richard's movements carried a careful gentleness, as though afraid Ethan might vanish if he pressed too hard. Ethan, in turn, offered a mixture of curiosity and trust, surrendering to the experience with a vulnerability that cut through Richard's practiced composure. What they shared was not hurried passion alone, it was the startling recognition of need, the kind that had gone unanswered for years. In the aftermath, as they lay in the muted glow of the bedside lamp, silence pressed between them. Richard stared at the ceiling, aware of the betrayal etched into his actions. Yet beside him, Ethan slept lightly, one arm draped across Richard's chest, and for the first time in decades he felt not empty but whole. The affair continued in fragments of stolen time. Business dinners became excuses, late meetings turned into secret rendezvous. Hotels, quiet cafes, dimly lit corners of the city, all became witnesses to their hidden connection. Richard found himself laughing again, rediscovering a sense of vitality he thought long extinguished. Ethan thrived on the attention, the sense of being desired not just for youth but for who he was. But cracks soon appeared. Helen noticed the late nights, the vague explanations that no longer aligned. Suspicion flickered in her eyes, though she said nothing at first. Richard felt the weight of her silence more than if she had shouted. At work, he caught himself distracted, missing details he once handled flawlessly. The double life strained him, and yet the thought of ending things with Ethan felt unbearable. Ethan, meanwhile, wrestled with guilt of his own. Friends asked about his love life, and he deflected with half-truths, knowing he could not explain Richard without exposing the forbidden nature of what they shared. Some nights, lying awake alone, he wondered if he was merely a secret, a temporary escape for a man unwilling to face his reality. One evening, as Richard sat at home, his phone lit up with Ethan's name. Helen sat across the room, reading, her presence heavy with unspoken suspicion. The glow of the screen felt like fire against his palm. He hesitated, thumb hovering, heart thundering. Answering would mean deepening the lie. Ignoring it would mean hurting the one person who had reignited his sense of self. Richard slipped the phone face down on the table, forcing himself to breathe. Helen glanced up, her eyes narrowing slightly, though she said nothing. The silence in the room thickened until it felt suffocating. Upstairs, when he was finally alone, Richard stared at the phone again. The message was simple, "I miss you." His chest ached at the words. He typed a reply, then erased it. He sat on the edge of the bed, torn between two lives, two selves. Outside, the night stretched endlessly, quiet yet heavy, as though waiting for him to decide which truth he would claim. And as Richard finally lifted the phone, Ethan's name glowing in the darkness, he realized there was no choice that would not wound someone, including himself.